When Grace opened the door that rainy afternoon, her eyes met a man she knew only from the city's whispers. Julian Blake, millionaire, powerful, feared. He didn't smile, didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "I need you to marry me." At 22, a virgin and desperate to save her grandmother, she felt the world stop. Why would a man like him choose someone like her? And why did his words sound more like a promise than a proposal? What Grace didn't know was that night would change everything. If you want to know what happens next, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel and tell me, where are you listening from? Grace Whitmore had always known her life was different from other girls in town. While her school friends talked about boyfriends, parties, and dreams of escaping the small town of Millbrook, she found peace among the dusty shelves of the municipal library, where silence was her greatest companion, and the smell of old books soothed her restless soul. "Gracie, my dear, you need to get out more," Martha, her grandmother, would say every morning as they prepared coffee together in their small kitchen. Steam rose from the white porcelain cups, mingling with the aroma of cinnamon and homemade bread that always lingered in the air. Martha stirred her sugar slowly, watching Grace with those blue eyes faded by time, but still full of love. A girl your age should be discovering the world, meeting people, living adventures. Grace would smile, kissing the wrinkled forehead of the woman who had raised her with such care. Her hands would gently touch Martha's grey hair, feeling the soft texture that had always comforted her since childhood. "The world can wait, Grandma. You are my world." And it was true. Since that terrible night when she was only 8 years old, Martha had been her anchor in an ocean of pain and uncertainty. Grace still remembered fragments of that tragedy, like cutting shards in her memory. The phone ringing shrilly late at night, breaking the silence of the sleeping house, the trembling voice of the police officer on the other end. Martha falling to her knees in the living room, her sobs echoing through the walls like an ancestral lament. Her parents, returning from a romantic dinner to celebrate their 15th wedding anniversary, never made it home. A drunk driver had taken everything from her in a matter of seconds, transforming a night of celebration into irreversible tragedy. "They were talking about you in the car, my girl," Martha had whispered that first terrible night, holding Grace as she cried against her soft chest that smelled of lavender and sadness. "The last thing they did was talk about how proud they were of their smart and sweet daughter. They loved you so much, that I can still feel that love echoing throughout this house." At 22, Grace carried that pain silently, like an invisible scar that had shaped every choice, every breath, every beat of her heart. While other women her age went on weekend dates, laughed loudly at parties, and discovered the mysteries of first love, she preferred quiet afternoons, organizing books by the color of their spines, or playing the old grand piano her parents had bought when she was born. The yellowed keys responded to her touch with sweet melancholy, each note echoing through the walls of the small house she shared with Martha like a silent prayer. The sound spread through the rooms, creating an atmosphere of nostalgia and peace that made her feel connected to the parents she would never see again. "You play just like your mother," Martha would say, stopping whatever she was doing to listen, her weathered hands holding the dish towel as she leaned against the doorframe. She had those same delicate hands, you know. She used to say music was the soul's way of talking directly to God, without needing words or explanations. It was in moments like these that Grace felt the weight of absence like a stone in her chest. She didn't know a man's touch, had never been kissed, had never felt that urgent flutter her friends described when they talked about love and passion. Her innocence wasn't just physical, it was emotional, built by years of Martha's careful protection, who deeply feared that the cruel world would hurt her granddaughter the way it had hurt her daughter. "Gracie," said Sarah, her only close friend, on a sunny Saturday afternoon as they drank iced tea on the shaded porch of the house. The wind swayed the white curtains, bringing the sweet scent of roses that Martha cultivated in the garden. "Don't you think you're hiding from life? I mean, you're beautiful, intelligent, you have a huge heart. Why not give someone a chance? Jake from the pharmacy always asks about you." Grace shifted uncomfortably in her delicate cup, avoiding her friend's insistent gaze. The ice clinked against the porcelain, creating a crystalline sound that broke the tense silence. "I don't know if I'm ready, Sarah. What if I get hurt? What if I don't know how to be what a man expects? I don't even know how to talk about these things." "Love doesn't come with an instruction manual, honey," Sarah laughed softly, her eyes shining with understanding and affection. "You learn by living, making mistakes, trying again. Your parents met young and built something beautiful and lasting together. Why can't you have the same thing? Why deny yourself this chance at happiness?" The question echoed in Grace's mind for days and nights. When she was alone, especially in the quiet hours before dawn, she would stand on the porch watching the twinkling stars in the dark sky, wondering if there was something fundamentally wrong with feeling complete in that simple and protected life. Maybe her extreme caution was a necessary shield, a desperate way to protect what little remained of her devastated family. Losing Martha would be like dying a second time, as if the 8-year-old girl who cried over her parents' death would finally disappear forever. At the municipal library where she worked part-time, organizing books and helping occasional visitors, Grace knew all the love stories on the spines she touched daily. Romance, passion, total surrender. It all seemed so distant from her controlled and predictable reality. She would discreetly watch young couples who entered hand in hand, whispering intimate secrets to each other, exchanging looks loaded with promises, and felt a strange and disturbing mixture of burning curiosity and paralyzing fear. "Miss Whitmore," said Mr. Henderson, the head librarian, on a particularly quiet afternoon when only the sound of pages being turned broke the sacred silence of the place. "Have you ever seriously thought about going to college? I'm absolutely certain you could get a full scholarship. A brilliant mind like yours shouldn't be stuck here forever, wasting all that potential." Grace smiled politely, but her response came automatically, rehearsed by years of repetition. "I can't leave my grandmother, Mr. Henderson. She needs me now more than ever." It was always the same mechanical answer for all the opportunities that appeared in her life, as if her existence were a frozen bank account, waiting indefinitely for something that might never come, to finally be released and used. That night, arriving home after a long day at the library, Grace found Martha in the kitchen, holding an official letter with visibly trembling hands. The white envelope contrasted with her pale fingers, and there was something in the air that smelled of fear and unshared secrets. "What is that, Grandma?" Grace asked, approaching slowly. Martha hesitated for a moment that seemed eternal, then quickly folded the letter, hiding it against her chest. "Nothing important, dear. Just boring old people papers you don't need to worry about." But Grace clearly saw the fear in Martha's eyes, the way her hands trembled involuntarily, how her gentle features contracted with genuine concern. There was something her grandmother was desperately hiding, something that made the kitchen air feel heavier and more threatening. Later that night, when Martha was finally sleeping soundly, Grace found the letter forgotten on the kitchen table. It was from a specialist doctor in the neighboring town, scheduling tests that sounded frighteningly serious and urgent. Words like immediate investigation and concerning results jumped from the paper like stabs to her heart. Grace's heart raced uncontrollably. Without Martha, she would be truly alone in the world, orphaned for the second time. And for the first time in years, she realized with painful clarity that her protected and predictable life might not be enough to face the storm that was approaching. The medical appointment happened on a gray Tuesday morning, when fall had already painted the leaves gold and red, creating a crunchy carpet under Grace and Martha's feet as they walked slowly to the doctor's office. Dr. Stevens, a man with graying hair and kind eyes, examined the results with an expression Grace had learned to fear, that mixture of professionalism and compassion doctors use when they have bad news to deliver. "Martha," he said gently, adjusting his glasses on his nose while holding the test results with reverent care. "The results confirm our suspicions. It's a pancreatic tumor, and we need to start treatment immediately." Grace felt the world spin around her. The words echoed in the small office like gunshots, each syllable piercing her soul with surgical precision. Martha, sitting beside her in the worn leather chair, simply nodded with a calmness that frightened Grace more than any scream of despair would have. "How long?" Martha asked, her voice steady, despite the trembling hands clutching her brown leather purse in her lap. "With aggressive treatment, we can buy precious time. Chemotherapy, surgery if possible, experimental medications. But I won't lie to you. The situation is serious and treatment will be expensive." Grace swallowed hard, tasting the bitter flavor of fear in her throat. "How expensive?" Dr. Stevens hesitated, consulting a thick folder full of papers. We're talking about at least $50,000 in the first 6 months, maybe more depending on how she responds to treatment. The number fell on Grace like an avalanche. $50,000. They could barely pay the basic household bills, with Grace's modest salary at the library and Martha's small retirement pension. The house was mortgaged, they had no significant savings, and the cheap health insurance, they had only covered a fraction of the costs. "We'll find a way," Grace whispered, holding Martha's cold hand between hers. "I'll find a way." During the walk home, they traveled in heavy silence, each lost in their own terrifying thoughts. The cold October wind whipped their faces, and Grace pulled her coat tighter around her body, desperately wishing she could protect Martha the same way. "Gracie," Martha finally said, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk and turning to face her granddaughter. Her blue eyes, once bright, now seemed faded with worry. "You can't sacrifice your life for me. I've already lived my life, had my happy moments." "Don't talk like that," Grace exclaimed, her voice breaking with raw emotion. "You're everything I have. Without you, I'm nothing." The following weeks turned into a nightmare of medical bills arriving in the mail like sharp blades, each white envelope stamped with numbers that made Grace feel nauseous. She picked up extra shifts at the library, working from early morning until late at night, organizing books until her fingers ached and her eyes burned with fatigue. "Grace, you're killing yourself," Sarah said one afternoon when she found her asleep on a pile of books in the fiction section. "When was the last time you slept properly?" "I can't stop," Grace mumbled, rubbing her eyes red with exhaustion. "Every hour I rest is money I'm not earning. Martha needs the treatment." She started selling everything of value. First came her mother's jewelry. A pearl necklace she'd worn on her wedding day, small diamond earrings that had belonged to her great-grandmother, the engagement ring Grace had treasured. Each piece sold tore away a piece of her soul, as if she were betraying her parents' memory. "Don't do this, dear," Martha begged when she saw Grace packing the pearl necklace in a small blue velvet box. "Your mother's jewelry is all you have left of her." "My mother would understand," Grace replied, trying to keep her voice steady while closing the box with trembling hands. "She would do the same thing for you." The town antique dealer offered a ridiculously low amount for the pieces, but Grace had no choice. She accepted the money with dignity, tucking the crumpled bills into her wallet with her heart broken into pieces. Next came the antique furniture. The mahogany dining table that had belonged to Martha's great-grandparents, the cushioned chairs that had witnessed decades of family meals, the ornate hallway mirror that had reflected generations of smiles and tears. Each piece that left the house took with it a fragment of family history. But even then, it wasn't enough. The bills kept coming with increasingly alarming numbers. Grace calculated and recalculated obsessively, scribbling numbers on scraps of paper until the early hours of morning, searching for mathematical miracles that simply didn't exist. "Maybe I should stop treatment," Martha said one morning, watching Grace count and recount the few bills remaining in her wallet. "It's not worth destroying your life for a few more months of mine." "Never!" Grace shouted, surprising them both with the intensity of her voice. "Never say that again. I'd rather starve than let you give up." That's when Grace made the most painful decision of her life. On a rainy November afternoon, she walked to the pawn shop downtown, carrying the family's grand piano in a small music box, the last tangible memory of her parents she had left. The man behind the counter, fat and indifferent, examined the piano with cold commercial eyes. "It's a nice piece, but old. I can offer $2,000. Grace closed her eyes, feeling tears burn behind her eyelids. The piano was worth at least 10 times more, but she was desperate. "I'll take it." When she returned home without the piano, Martha was waiting in the living room with eyes full of tears. "You didn't need to do that, my girl." "Yes, I did," Grace whispered, collapsing on the sofa next to her grandmother, "because I love you more than any object in this world." But even with all the sacrifices, the money was running out quickly. Grace calculated that in 2 weeks, they wouldn't have anything left to pay for the next round of chemotherapy. The feeling of helplessness consumed her from within, making her wake up in the middle of the night with her heart racing with panic. It was on one of those sleepless nights that she heard Martha sobbing quietly in the kitchen, holding a pile of medical bills in her trembling hands. "Grandma," Grace whispered, approaching slowly. Martha lifted her tear-stained face. "I feel so useless, Gracie. You're killing yourself because of me." Grace knelt beside the chair, holding her cold hands. "You've never been useless. You're the most important person in my world." But when Martha finally slept, Grace allowed herself to feel the total despair that was eating her alive from inside. They were losing the battle, and she didn't know what else to do. She had exhausted all options, sold everything she owned, worked to the point of exhaustion. And then the rain started dripping through a leak in the kitchen ceiling, creating a puddle on the worn floor. Another expense they couldn't afford. Grace looked out the window at the empty, wet street, where the streetlights created yellow circles in the darkness. And here she was, a 22-year-old young woman carrying the weight of the world on her fragile shoulders. That night, Grace realized she was completely alone against a battle she couldn't win. The December rain beat violently against the windows of the small house when Grace heard the firm knocks on the front door. There were exactly 3 knocks, deliberate and measured, cutting through the monotonous sound of the storm. She lifted her eyes from the medical bills scattered across the kitchen table, where she had spent the entire morning trying to find mathematical miracles that didn't exist. "Who could it be in all this rain?" Martha murmured from the armchair where she was resting, covered with the crocheted blanket they had managed to keep after selling almost everything. Grace dried her hands on her apron and walked to the door, her bare feet making soft sounds on the worn wooden floor. Through the fogged glass, she could only make out the tall silhouette of a man wearing something dark. When she opened the door, the cold, damp wind invaded the house, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and something else, an expensive, musky fragrance she had never smelled before. The man before her was striking in a way that made her swallow involuntarily. Tall, with broad shoulders that perfectly filled the black wool coat he wore, he possessed a presence that seemed to suck all the air around him. His dark hair was slightly wet from the rain, and small drops ran down his angular forehead, but it was his eyes that paralyzed her, grey like the storm outside, penetrating and cold, studying her with an intensity that made her feel completely exposed. "You're Grace Whitmore," he said, and it wasn't a question. His voice was deep, controlled, carrying a natural authority that made people pay attention. There was no warmth in it, only absolute certainty that left her unsettled. Yes," she stammered, pulling her cardigan tighter around her body. "Can I help you?" He didn't smile, didn't offer explanations, didn't apologize for showing up unannounced on a stormy afternoon. He simply watched her for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, his eyes traveling over her face as if memorizing every detail. "Julian Blake," he finally introduced himself, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "We need to talk." The name hit her like lightning. Julian Blake. Everyone in Millbrook knew that name, whispered about him in tones of reverence and fear. The tycoon who had built an empire from nothing, the man who could buy and sell the entire town if he wanted to. His companies employed half the local population, his businesses extended throughout the state, and his influence was legendary. But no one really knew him. He was an almost mythical figure, occasionally seen in expensive cars passing through the streets, but always distant, always unreachable. "Thais, what do you want with me?" Grace asked, her voice sounding small and fragile against the noise of the rain. "May I come in?" It wasn't really a question, and she instinctively stepped aside, allowing him to cross the threshold. He filled the small space of the living room with his dominant presence, his eyes quickly scanning the environment, the remaining furniture, the peeling walls, the obvious signs of financial hardship. "Gracie, who is it?" Martha's frail voice came from the living room, loaded with curiosity and a touch of concern. Julian turned toward the voice, and Grace saw something almost imperceptible pass through his eyes, a shadow of something that might have been compassion, but it passed so quickly she wasn't sure if she had really seen it. "My grandmother," Grace explained quickly, moving to stand between Julian and the room where Martha was resting. A wild protective instinct had taken over her, even without understanding why this man was there. "Grace, I want to make you a proposal," Julian said without beating around the bush, completely ignoring normal social protocols. He didn't sit down, didn't accept coffee, didn't make small talk. He simply got straight to the point with brutal efficiency. "I know about your grandmother's situation. I know about the medical debts, about what you've been selling, about the desperation you're both facing." Grace's blood ran cold. "How do you know that?" A cold smile touched his lips, but didn't reach his eyes. I know many things, Grace. It's my business to know. She felt a wave of indignation rise in her chest. If you came here to buy our house for a fraction of its value or offer us some loan shark deal, you can leave right now. No, he said simply. And there was something in the way he pronounced that single word that made her stop talking. I came to offer a solution. Grace crossed her arms, trying to appear more confident than she felt. What kind of solution? Julian studied her for a long and uncomfortable moment, as if evaluating her ability to handle what he was about to say. When he finally spoke, his words fell between them like heavy stones. Marry me. The world stopped. Grace blinked several times, certain she had misunderstood. What? Marry me, he repeated, with the same naturalness with which he would state the weather. In exchange, I'll take care of all your grandmother's medical expenses, the best doctors, the best treatments, experimental medications if necessary, and you'll never have to worry about money again. Grace felt her legs go weak. She leaned against the doorframe, trying to process what she had just heard. You're crazy? I'm being perfectly rational, Julian replied, his voice maintaining that cold and controlled tone. You need money. I need a wife. It's a mutually beneficial transaction. A transaction? Grace repeated, disbelief coloring her voice. You're talking about marriage like it's a business deal. That's exactly what it is, he said without hesitation. A contract. Clean, simple, advantageous for both parties. Grace shook her head vigorously, trying to shake off the feeling of living a surreal nightmare. I don't even know you. Why on earth would you want to marry me? Something darkened in his eyes, a shadow that made her instinctively step back. My reasons are my own, Grace. All you need to know is that I'm offering you a way out of your desperate situation. This is insane, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Completely insane. It's practical, Julian corrected coldly. Your grandmother has how many months? 3, 4 at most. Without proper treatment, maybe weeks. You can stand there struggling with your moral indignation while she wastes away, or you can make a decision that will save her life. His words were like slaps, each one hitting Grace with surgical precision. Tears burned her eyes, but she held them back with pure willpower. And what do you get out of this? She asked, her voice trembling with contained emotion. Julian hesitated for the first time since he had entered the house. His eyes looked away momentarily, as if he were struggling with something internal. When he looked at her again, there was a hardness in his expression that hadn't been there before. That's none of your business, he said finally. Do you accept or not? Grace looked back toward the living room where Martha was resting, probably wondering about the whispered conversation at the entrance. Her grandmother, who had sacrificed everything to raise her, who deserved to live her final years in peace and not in agony. Then she looked back at Julian Blake, this powerful stranger who had appeared out of nowhere with an impossible proposal. I need to think, she murmured. You have until tomorrow, Julian said, turning to leave. I'll be back at 7 in the evening for your answer. He stopped at the door, the rain creating a curtain between him and the dark night. Grace, he said without turning around, your grandmother doesn't have time for you to have doubts. And then he was gone, disappearing into the storm like an apparition, leaving only the echo of his words and the musky fragrance that seemed to have permeated the air of the small house. Grace spent the entire night walking through the small house like a caged animal, her bare feet making noise against the wooden floor, while her mind spun in desperate circles. At 5 in the morning, when the first ray of sunlight filtered through the faded curtains, she finally surrendered to the inevitable. Martha needed treatment, and Julian Blake was the only way out. When he returned that night, punctually at 7, he found Grace waiting on the porch, wearing the only decent dress she still owned, a simple navy blue that had belonged to her mother. She had spent the entire day explaining the situation to Martha, who protested vehemently until she understood it was a matter of life and death. Your answer? Julian asked without preamble, climbing the porch steps with controlled and precise movements. I accept, Grace said, the words coming from her throat like ground glass. But with conditions. He raised an eyebrow, clearly not accustomed to being challenged. Which ones? Martha stays with me. Wherever I go, she goes too. And I want to see the medical treatment contracts before I sign anything. Julian studied her for a long moment, as if re-evaluating who she really was. Done, he said finally. We'll marry on Friday. Friday? Grace choked. That's in 3 days. I see no reason for delays, Julian replied coldly. The longer we wait, the worse your grandmother's condition gets. The ceremony took place on a cold December morning at the town courthouse, a grey and lifeless building that smelled of old paper and disinfectant. Grace wore a simple white dress that Sarah had lent her, 2 sizes too big, making her look even more fragile and lost. There were no flowers, no music, no guests besides Martha and Sarah as witnesses. The judge, an elderly man with thick glasses, read the vows with the monotony of someone who had repeated the same words for decades. Grace could barely hear because of the buzzing in her ears, as if she were submerged in water. When it was her turn to speak, her voice came out as a trembling whisper. I do. Julian beside her seemed completely at ease, as if he were signing just another business contract. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, he turned to Grace with an impenetrable expression. You may kiss the bride, the judge said with a forced smile. Julian leaned down and placed a quick, cold kiss on Grace's lips, so brief she barely had time to process the contact. His lips were firm and cold, and there was no emotion in the gesture, just obligation fulfilled. Done, he murmured against her ear, his warm breath contrasting with the coldness of his words. Now you're my wife. The words sent a shiver down Grace's spine, but she couldn't decide if it was from fear or anticipation. After the ceremony, Julian guided Grace and Martha to a luxurious black car waiting outside. The driver, a middle-aged man wearing a dark suit, opened the doors without a word. The interior smelled of expensive leather and had a silence that seemed to swallow any sound. Where are we going? Grace asked as the car glided through Millbrook's familiar streets. Home, Julian replied without looking at her, his fingers drumming against the dark window. The mansion appeared gradually through the fine rain, emerging from the landscape like something out of a dream or nightmare. It was immense, a dark stone construction that extended in several directions, with pointed towers that pierced the grey sky. Tall, narrow windows looked out at the world like empty eyes, and an iron fence separated the property from the rest of the world. My God, Martha whispered beside Grace, her frail hand squeezing her granddaughter's. It's bigger than the town library. The car stopped in front of an imposing entrance with double doors of dark oak. Before Grace could fully process where she was, the doors opened and a middle-aged woman came out to greet them. She was tall and thin, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and an expression that suggested absolute efficiency. This is Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, Julian explained as they got out of the car. She'll take care of everything you need. Mrs. Henderson made a polite curtsy, her eyes studying Grace and Martha with barely disguised curiosity. Welcome to Ravenshollow, she said with a voice that was courteous, but not exactly warm. Grace held Martha's arm as they climbed the marble steps leading to the main entrance. The doors opened to reveal a foyer that took her breath away. Extremely high ceilings with crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen tears, marble staircases that curved in opposite directions, ancient paintings in golden frames watching from dark wood-paneled walls. Your quarters are in the East Wing, Julian said, his voice echoing in the vast space. Mrs. Henderson will show the way. Our quarters? Grace asked, confusion coloring her voice. Julian stopped in the middle of the foyer and turned to face her. You have your suite, I have mine. I thought it would be more appropriate that way. There was something in his voice she couldn't identify. Relief? Disappointment? She wasn't sure if she felt insulted or grateful for the distance he was establishing. Mrs. Henderson led them through corridors that seemed to extend infinitely, passing closed doors that hid mysteries Grace didn't dare imagine. The walls were decorated with portraits of people she didn't know, all looking with serious and penetrating expressions. This will be your suite, Mrs. Blake, Mrs. Henderson said, opening double doors to reveal a room that was larger than the entire house where Grace had grown up. Grace entered slowly, her feet sinking into the thick Persian carpet. The bed was enormous, with a canopy and dark blue velvet curtains. Tall windows offered a view of the extensive gardens, where ancient trees swayed in the wind like somber sentinels. "And Mrs. Martha will stay in the adjacent room," Mrs. Henderson continued, opening a door that connected the two quarters. "There's a bell in each room if you need anything." When they were alone, Grace and Martha looked at each other in silence for a long moment. The reality of what had happened finally began to sink in. "Gracie," Martha whispered, her voice small in the vast space. "What have you done?" Grace sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the mattress yielding under her weight in a way that seemed to embrace her. "I saved your life, Grandma." "But at what cost?" Martha asked, approaching and sitting beside her granddaughter. "You married a stranger, a man you don't love, who doesn't love you." Grace looked out the window at the dark gardens outside, where the rain created hypnotic patterns against the glass. "Love is a luxury we can't afford, Grandma. This is survival." Later that night, when Martha was finally sleeping in the next room, Grace lay awake staring at the ornate ceiling of her new bedroom. Every sound of the old house seemed amplified in the darkness. Wind whispering through the windows, wood creaking in distant places, footsteps echoing in corridors she had yet to explore. She was married to a man who was practically a stranger, living in a house that looked like a castle from a dark fairy tale. And for the first time since Julian Blake had appeared at her door, Grace allowed herself to wonder what she had really gotten herself into. The first days at Ravens Hollow passed like a strange fog for Grace. She woke up every morning expecting to find herself back in the small house with Martha, only to be greeted by the ornate high ceilings and the oppressive silence that seemed to swallow all sounds. The mansion was too big, too quiet, full of shadows that moved in the corners of her vision and corridors that seemed to lead nowhere. Mrs. Henderson established a rigid routine that Grace followed like a sleepwalker. Breakfast at 8 in the smaller dining room, a room that was still larger than the kitchen of her former home. Lunch at noon in the formal dining room, where there were so many chairs she felt lost at the head of the long table. Dinner at 7, always served with military precision by silent staff who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Julian was rarely present for meals. She would see him occasionally through the windows, walking through the gardens with his phone pressed to his ear, his tall figure cutting a dark silhouette against the grey winter sky. Other times, she would hear his voice echoing from some distant office, always speaking in low, controlled tones that carried unquestionable authority. "Where does he spend most of his time?" Grace asked Mrs. Henderson one morning, while watching Julian disappear toward the north wing of the mansion. "Mr. Blake has his business to attend to," Mrs. Henderson replied diplomatically, arranging the breakfast plates with precise movements. "He's a very busy man." There was something in the way the housekeeper avoided her eyes that suggested this wasn't the whole truth. Grace began exploring the mansion alone, her footsteps echoing through the vast corridors as she discovered room after room decorated with antique furniture and expensive Persian rugs. There was an immense library with shelves that extended from floor to ceiling, filled with books in languages she didn't recognize. A music room with a grand piano that was perfectly tuned but covered with a thin layer of dust that suggested no one had played it in a long time. A conservatory with exotic plants that seemed to thrive despite the apparent lack of care. But there were doors that remained locked, no matter how much she turned the ornate handles. The entire west wing seemed to be sealed off, with a discreet but firm chain stretched across the entrance. When she asked about it, Mrs. Henderson simply said they were Mr. Blake's private quarters and quickly changed the subject. It was during her explorations that Grace began to notice the whispers. At first, she thought they were just the natural sounds of an old house. Wood creaking, wind in the windows, pipes making noise in the walls. But gradually she began to distinguish low voices coming from directions that seemed to have no source, fragmented conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached, footsteps that echoed in empty corridors when she passed by. "Did you hear that?" she asked Martha one afternoon, when a particularly clear murmur had come from the wall behind the bed. Martha, who had been much better since treatment had begun, frowned. "Hear what, dear?" "Voices," Grace said, approaching the wall and pressing her ear against the ornate wallpaper. "Like there were people talking on the other side." "This house is very old," Martha said gently. "Old houses make strange noises. Maybe it's just the staff working." But Grace knew it wasn't the staff. She had learned their schedules, knew when Mrs. Henderson directed the cleaning crew through their daily routine. These whispers came at strange hours, late at night when everyone should be sleeping, or early in the morning before anyone was awake. It was on a particularly restless night that Grace decided to follow the sound. She had awakened to the sound of voices coming from the corridor, clearer than ever. Wearing only the silk nightgown that Mrs. Henderson had provided, she opened her bedroom door silently and peered out. The corridor was shrouded in shadows, lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through the tall windows. The voices were coming from the direction of the main staircase. Grace followed the sound, her bare feet making soft noises against the cold marble floor. The closer she got, the clearer the voices became. Two people, one of whom she recognized as Julian, speaking in urgent, low tones. "It can't continue like this," an unknown voice was saying. "It's too dangerous." "It's necessary," Julian replied, his voice carrying that controlled coldness she had learned to recognize. "She can't know, not yet. What if she finds out? What if she starts asking questions?" There was a long pause before Julian answered. "Then we'll deal with it when it happens." Grace pressed herself against the wall, her heart beating so loudly she was sure they could hear it. What were they talking about? What couldn't she know? "The resemblance is disturbing," the unknown voice continued, "especially with her wearing those dresses. It's like—" "I know," Julian cut off abruptly. "You think I don't know?" Grace took a deep breath and leaned a little more to try to see who the other person was, but her foot slipped slightly on the smooth marble. The small sound echoed in the silence like a gunshot. The voices stopped immediately. Grace held her breath, pressing herself against the wall so hard that the ornate wallpaper imprinted on her skin. For one terrible moment, there was only absolute silence. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming in her direction. Without thinking, she ran back to her room, her feet slipping on the marble as she tried to move as quietly as possible. She reached her door and closed it carefully, pressing her ear against the wood to listen. The footsteps stopped outside her door. Grace held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs as she imagined Julian on the other side, knowing she had been listening. Seconds passed like hours until the footsteps finally moved away. She lay in bed with trembling hands, her mind racing with questions she had no answers to. What secrets was Julian hiding? Why couldn't she know? And what had the other person said about resemblance to whom? The next morning, during breakfast, Julian appeared for the first time in days. He sat at the table with his usual dominant presence, but Grace noticed that his eyes studied her with a new and disturbing intensity. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice too casual to be genuine. "Yes," Grace lied, avoiding his eyes while stirring her coffee without drinking it. "Great," Julian said, but there was something in his tone that suggested he knew exactly that she was lying. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you've been exploring the house. I hope you're feeling at home." "It's a very interesting house," Grace replied carefully. Julian smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Ravens Hollow has a lot of history, many secrets hidden in its walls." He paused, his grey eyes fixed on hers. "But some things are better left undiscovered." The message was clear. Stop asking questions, stop exploring, stop listening to conversations that weren't meant for your ears. But for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, Grace felt a spark of determination ignite in her chest. Julian Blake had secrets, and somehow they involved her, and she was determined to find out what they were. The first crack in Julian's cold facade appeared on a sunny January morning when Grace accompanied Martha to a medical appointment in town. Dr. Stevens had asked to see them personally to discuss the treatment progress, and Grace felt hopeful for the first time in months, seeing the color returning to her grandmother's face. They were leaving the office when Grace heard the malicious voices coming from the small group of women gathered near the pharmacy. She immediately recognized Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Caldwell, two of Millbrook's most notorious gossips, accompanied by three other women whose faces she vaguely knew from church. "There goes the new Mrs. Blake," Mrs. Patterson said loudly enough to ensure Grace could hear. "I wonder what a man like Julian Blake saw in her." "Obvious, isn't it?" Mrs. Caldwell replied with a cruel laugh. "He wanted a young, inexperienced wife who wouldn't ask questions, someone he could control." Grace felt the blood rise to her face, but she tried to ignore the women while helping Martha down the office steps. Martha, frail but determined, squeezed her hand in silent support. "I bet it was the money that attracted her," a third voice joined in. "These poor girls have always gone after rich men. She probably threw herself at him at the first opportunity." "A gold digger," Mrs. Patterson agreed with disdain. "And that sick grandmother. How convenient, right? Gave her the perfect excuse to marry a stranger." Grace stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, her hands trembling with humiliation and anger. The women's words cut deep, because they carried a grain of truth she couldn't deny. She really had married Julian for money, for Martha's treatment. But hearing it said so crudely and cruelly made her soul contract with shame. "Don't listen to them, dear," Martha whispered, but Grace could see that the words had also hurt her grandmother. That's when a familiar and controlled voice cut through the air like a blade. "Ladies." Julian had appeared out of nowhere, his dominant presence making the group of women fall silent instantly. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his hands casually in his pockets, but there was something dangerous in his relaxed posture. "Mr. Blake," Mrs. Patterson stammered, clearly mortified at being caught talking badly about his wife. "We weren't... I mean..." "You weren't what?" Julian asked softly, approaching the group with slow, predatory movements. "Weren't discussing my wife in public as if she were entertainment." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Grace watched fascinated as Julian transformed his usual coldness into a weapon, his grey eyes scanning each face with an intensity that made the women visibly shrink. "Let me clarify something," Julian continued, his voice maintaining that dangerously soft tone. "Grace is my wife. That means she has my absolute protection. Anyone who chooses to speak ill of her will be speaking ill of me directly." Mrs. Caldwell tried to regain her composure. You were gossiping like old hags with nothing better to do," Julian cut off mercilessly, "and now you're embarrassing my wife in public." Grace watched in silent shock as Julian systematically dismantled the women's dignity with just a few well-placed words. She had never seen anyone defend her honor before, especially not with such authority and power. "Mrs. Patterson," Julian said, focusing his attention on the group's leader, "I believe your husband still owes 3 months' rent on the warehouse he leases from my company. And Mrs. Caldwell, your son's loan to expand the mechanic shop is still under review, isn't it?" The implicit threat hung in the air like poisonous smoke. Both women paled, understanding perfectly that Julian Blake had the power to ruin their financial lives with a simple word. "I suggest you find something more productive to occupy your time," Julian concluded coldly. "And next time you feel like discussing my family, remember that I always find out who's spreading rumors." The women dispersed quickly, mumbling rushed apologies and avoiding eye contact. In a matter of seconds, the sidewalk was empty, except for Julian, Grace, and Martha. Julian turned to Grace, and she saw something in his eyes she had never noticed before. Genuine concern mixed with residual anger directed at the women who had humiliated her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice losing all coldness and gaining a softness that surprised her. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice not to tremble. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "Don't thank me," Julian said, offering his arm to Martha with a gentleness that completely contradicted his cold reputation. "Let's get you home." During the ride back to Ravenshollow, Grace watched Julian interact with Martha with a patience and consideration that revealed a completely different side of his personality. He adjusted the car's heating when he noticed she was shivering, asked about her treatment with genuine interest, and even smiled, really smiled, when Martha told a funny story about Grace as a child. "You're very different from what people say," Martha commented when they arrived at the mansion. Julian paused while helping her out of the car. "And what do people say?" "That you're cold, cruel, heartless," Martha replied, with the brutal honesty that only elderly people allow themselves. But a heartless man wouldn't have defended Grace that way. Grace saw something pass across Julian's face, a shadow of pain that disappeared so quickly she almost thought she had imagined it. In the following days, Grace began to notice small gestures that suggested the public defense hadn't just been about maintaining appearances. Fresh flowers appeared in her room every morning, not elaborate arrangements, but simple bouquets of wildflowers that seemed to have been chosen with care. Her favorite books from the public library mysteriously appeared in the mansion's library. When she casually mentioned missing playing piano, the grand piano in the conservatory was tuned and the dust removed. "Mrs. Henderson," Grace asked one morning, "who has been bringing the flowers to my room?" The housekeeper smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Grace had seen from her. "Mr. Blake has a private garden at the back of the property. He picks them himself every morning before leaving for the office." Grace felt something warm expand in her chest. Julian Blake, the feared tycoon who could destroy lives with a word, was picking flowers for her every morning. But it was his interaction with Martha that most revealed his hidden character. Grace watched him one afternoon when she thought she wasn't looking, sitting beside Martha's armchair in the library, listening patiently while she told stories about Grace's parents. His posture was relaxed, his eyes attentive, and when Martha paused to cough, he offered a glass of water, with a naturalness that suggested genuine care. "He takes good care of you," Martha commented to Grace that night. "And of me, too. It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Grace asked. "A man who did business with human lives," Martha admitted. "But there's goodness in him, Gracie. It's well hidden, but it's there." Grace began to question her first impressions of Julian. The man who had appeared at her door with a cold marriage proposal still existed, but there were layers to him that she was just beginning to discover. Layers that suggested there might be more to his marriage proposal than a simple business transaction. But whenever she felt close to understanding Julian, he would retreat again behind the cold mask, leaving her wondering if the kindness she had glimpsed was real or just another carefully calculated aspect of his complex personality. It was like living with two different men in the same body, one who picked flowers at dawn and sat with an elderly lady to hear her stories, and another who could destroy lives with a few well-placed words. And Grace was beginning to suspect that both were equally real. The nightmare always began the same way, the sound of tires screeching on wet asphalt, followed by the metallic crash that seemed to tear the fabric of reality. Grace was 8 years old again, waiting in the living room while rain beat against the windows, when the phone rang with that sharp, insistent sound that carried bad news. But this time, in the dream, she was running. Running down the dark road, trying to reach her parents' car before the drunk driver appeared around the curve. Her small legs couldn't move fast enough. Her voice wasn't strong enough to scream a warning that could save them. She watched, helpless, as the lights approached at impossible speed. Grace woke up screaming. The sound tore through the mansion's quietude like a blade, echoing through the vast corridors before dying in silence. She sat up in bed, her heart beating uncontrollably, cold sweat covering her skin despite the room's warmth. The nightmare had been more vivid than ever, leaving her with the terrible feeling that she could still hear the sound of twisting metal. Her hands trembled as she tried to turn on the lamp on the nightstand, but it slipped between her sweat-dampened fingers and fell to the floor with a noise that sounded like a gunshot in the darkness. Grace collapsed into sobs, all the repressed pain of years finally finding an outlet. That's when she heard the footsteps, quick, determined, coming down the corridor. Someone had heard her scream. The door opened without ceremony, and Julian appeared in the doorway wearing only dark pajama pants, his hair disheveled from sleep. His eyes quickly scanned the room, looking for signs of danger, before landing on her. The moment he saw Grace huddled in bed, trembling with anguish, his expression changed completely. "Grace?" His voice was rough with sleep, but loaded with genuine concern. "What happened?" She tried to speak, but only more sobs came out. The tears she had held back for weeks, months, years, finally overflowed like a broken dam. All the fear, all the loneliness, all the weight of carrying alone the responsibility for Martha's life came to the surface at once. Julian hesitated for only a moment in the doorway, as if wrestling with some internal conflict. Then, surprising them both, he entered the room and gently closed the door behind him. "Was it a nightmare?" he asked gently, approaching the bed with careful movements as if she were a wounded animal that might flee at any moment. Grace nodded, unable to form words between the sobs that shook her entire body. Julian sat carefully on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance but offering his presence as comfort. "About your parents?" His voice was softer than she had ever heard it, stripped of all its usual coldness. I always dream that I can save them, Grace managed to whisper between tears. "That if I run fast enough, scream loud enough, I can stop it from happening, but I never can. I never can get there in time." Julian remained silent for a long moment, and when Grace finally looked up at him, she saw something in his expression she had never seen before. Deep, recognizable pain, as if he understood exactly what she was talking about. "How old were you?" he asked gently. 8, Grace whispered, wiping her face with trembling hands. "Martha said they were coming back from a romantic dinner. It was their wedding anniversary. They were talking about me in the car when—" Her voice broke again, and to her complete surprise, Julian moved closer. He hesitated for a moment, then reached out and gently brushed away a strand of hair stuck to her tears. "You couldn't have saved them," he said, with quiet certainty that cut through her guilt like a balm. "You were a child. It wasn't your responsibility to protect them. But if I had done something different that night, if I had asked them not to go out, if I had pretended to be sick, then you would be carrying guilt that isn't yours," Julian interrupted gently. "Trust me, Grace, I know what it's like to carry the weight of deaths that are beyond our control." There was something in his voice that made Grace stop crying and really look at him. In Julian's grey eyes she saw a reflection of her own pain, old, deep, carefully hidden but never fully healed. "You lost someone too," she said, not a question but a whispered statement. Julian looked away, his muscles tensing as if he were preparing to retreat behind the cold mask. But then, to Grace's surprise, he nodded slowly. "My sister," he said, the words coming out as if torn from somewhere deep and painful inside him. "Eleanor. She was 16 when she died. I was 22. Grace felt her heart contract with empathy. What happened? Julian was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with repressed emotion. "Leukemia. She fought for 2 years, but in the end—" He stopped, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. "I promised I would save her. I used my entire fortune, sought out the best doctors, experimental treatments, anything. But it wasn't enough." "Julian," Grace whispered, her own suffering momentarily forgotten in the face of the raw pain in his voice. "She used to play piano," he continued, as if now that he had started, he couldn't stop. "Every morning, before school, the whole house would wake up to the sound of her playing. When she died, the silence was deafening." Grace understood then why he had ordered the piano tuned for her, why he had removed the dust so carefully. It wasn't just kindness. It was a way to bring music back to a house that had been silent for too long. "That's why you chose me," she said softly, the pieces finally falling into place. "It wasn't random. There's something about me that reminds you of her." Julian met her eyes, and in them she saw naked vulnerability he had never shown before. "Elena was gentle like you, brave like you. She would have done anything to save someone she loved, like I did," Grace murmured, understanding. "Like you did," he confirmed. "When I saw you willing to marry a stranger to save Martha, I saw Elena. I saw the same quiet strength, the same fierce determination masked by gentleness." They looked at each other in silence, and Grace felt something fundamental shift between them. The careful distance Julian had maintained, the barriers he had built. Everything began to crumble in that moment of shared vulnerability. "Why didn't you ever tell me this before?" she asked. Julian smiled, a sad but genuine smile that completely transformed his face. "Because admitting I chose you for emotional reasons instead of purely practical ones would mean admitting I'm not the cold businessman everyone thinks I am." "And are you?" Grace asked. "Cold." Julian reached out hesitantly, his fingers lightly touching hers. "With you?" "No. I never could be cold with you, no matter how hard I tried." Grace felt fresh tears burn her eyes, but this time they weren't from pain. It was something more complex, relief, understanding, and the beginning of something she didn't yet dare to name. "Thank you," she whispered, "for telling me, for letting me know I'm not alone in this." "You never were," Julian said, his voice carrying a silent promise. "And you never will be." They remained like that for a long time, hands intertwined in the darkness, two wounded hearts finding comfort in each other. And for the first time since she had married Julian Blake, Grace felt that maybe, just maybe, she had found not just a savior, but someone who understood her completely. The trip to the coast had been Julian's idea. "Martha is responding well to treatment," he had said one February morning, watching Grace push food around her plate during breakfast. "You both deserve a few days away from doctors and hospitals." Julian's beach house sat on an isolated cliff overlooking the ocean, an elegant and simple refuge that contrasted dramatically with Ravens Hollow's Gothic grandeur. White walls, wide windows that invited in the sea light, and a deck that seemed to float above the waves. It was like another world entirely. Martha had settled comfortably in the main suite with Mrs. Henderson caring for her, leaving Grace and Julian alone for the first time since they'd married. The physical proximity without the mansion's vastness between them created a new and unsettling intimacy. "It's beautiful here," Grace said, standing on the front deck while the salty wind played with her hair. The sun was setting, painting the sky gold and pink, waves rhythmically beating against the rocks below. Julian approached, stopping beside her with his hands resting on the wooden railing. "Elena loved this place," he said softly. "We used to come here in the summers when we were children. She said the sound of the waves made her forget all the world's problems." Grace turned to look at him, observing how the golden light softened the hard lines of his face. Since the night he had comforted her after the nightmare, something had changed between them. Conversations were longer, silences less uncomfortable, and Grace found herself watching Julian when she thought he wasn't looking. "Julian," she said hesitantly, gathering courage for the question that had been burning inside her for weeks. "Why did you really marry me?" He was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun met the sea. "Do you want the answer I give other people, or do you want the truth?" "The truth," Grace said without hesitation. Julian turned to face her completely, his grey eyes serious and intense. "Because when I saw you at that door, desperate but determined to save the person you loved, you reminded me that there was still goodness in the world. And I had forgotten that completely." Grace felt her heart accelerate. "Just that." A sad smile touched his lips. "No, there was something more." He hesitated, as if struggling with the words. "You reminded me of Elena, yes. But more than that, you made me want to be the man she always believed I was. The man I stopped being when I lost her." "And what man is that?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone capable of loving without fear of losing. Someone who protects instead of just controlling. Someone who deserves the kindness you offer so easily." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. "Julian, I know our marriage started as a transaction," he continued, taking a step closer. "But for me, it stopped being that the moment you played piano for the first time at Ravens Hollow. When I heard music returning to that house—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Grace understood. "And for me," she said softly, "it stopped being a transaction when you defended my honor in town. When I saw that you cared about more than just fulfilling your part of the agreement." They were close now, close enough for Grace to see the golden flecks in his grey eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of his body cutting through the ocean's cold breeze. "Grace," Julian said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to know that I would never expect or demand physical intimacy from you. Our agreement didn't include that, and I would never—" "I know," Grace interrupted gently, placing her hand over his on the railing. "You made that clear from the beginning, but, he encouraged, when she hesitated. Grace took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. "But what if I wanted to? What if I chose to?" Julian became very quiet, his eyes searching hers as if trying to read her soul. "Would it really be your choice? Without coercion, without obligation, without misdirected gratitude?" "Do you think it's gratitude that makes me want to kiss you right now?" Grace asked, surprising them both with her boldness. Julian's eyes darkened, but he didn't move. "Grace, you're a virgin. You've never— Are you sure you understand what you're saying?" "I understand that I'm 22 years old, and that for the first time in my life, I'm looking at a man and feeling things," she said, blushing but determined. "I understand that when you touch me, even just casually, my heart races. I understand that I dream of you kissing me for real, not just that cold kiss from the ceremony." Julian closed his eyes for a moment, as if fighting some internal battle. "If we do this," he said finally, "there's no going back. It won't just be a convenient arrangement between us anymore." "Good," Grace said simply. Because I don't want it to be convenient anymore. Julian looked at her for a long moment, then slowly raised his hand to touch her face. His fingers were rough against her soft skin, but the touch was reverent, almost worshipful. "Are you sure?" he asked one last time. In response, Grace leaned in and pressed her lips against his. The kiss began soft, hesitant, a whispered question between two people who had spent months orbiting around each other without ever really touching. But when Julian responded, pulling her closer and deepening the kiss, Grace felt something ignite inside her. It was different from everything she had imagined. There was tenderness, yes, but also a hunger that surprised her. Julian kissed as if she were precious, but also as if she were his salvation, and Grace discovered she wanted to be both. When they finally separated, both were breathless. "Grace," Julian murmured against her forehead, "you have no idea what you do to me." "Then show me," she whispered back, surprising herself again with her own courage. Julian picked her up effortlessly, carrying her into the house while she laughed softly with nervousness and anticipation. He set her gently down on the floor of the main bedroom, where open windows let in the sound of waves and the moon's soft light. "We can stop at any time," he said, his hands framing her face. "Promise me you'll tell me if you want to stop." "I promise," Grace said, "but Julian, I don't want to stop." What happened next was a slow dance of discovery. Julian undressed her with reverence, his hands and lips exploring every inch of revealed skin as if she were a rare work of art. He whispered her name like a prayer, asked permission before each new touch, each new intimacy. Grace discovered that her body was capable of sensations she had never imagined. Each of Julian's caresses awakened nerve endings she didn't know existed. Each kiss sent waves of heat through her that left her trembling with need. "You're so beautiful," Julian murmured against her skin, and for the first time in her life, Grace really believed it. When they finally joined together, there were tears in Grace's eyes, not from pain, but from something much deeper. It was as if all the broken pieces inside her were finally fitting into place. Julian moved with her with infinite patience, his eyes never leaving hers, whispering words of love and encouragement as he guided her through each new sensation. And when pleasure finally took her, Grace understood why people wrote poetry about this. Afterward, they lay intertwined in bed, Grace's skin pressed against Julian's chest, while she listened to his heart beat strongly under her ear. The waves outside provided a soft soundtrack to their slowly normalizing breathing. "No regrets?" Julian asked softly, his fingers playing with her hair. Grace lifted her head to look at him. "None. And you?" Julian smiled, the first truly happy smile she had seen from him. "How could I regret something so perfect?" Grace snuggled closer to him, feeling completely safe for the first time in years. Outside, the ocean continued its eternal dance, and inside the small refuge they had created, two wounded souls had found healing in each other. "Julian," she murmured against his chest. "I love you." She felt his whole body tense for a moment, and for one terrible second, Grace wondered if she had said the wrong thing. Then Julian turned her so he could look into her eyes. "I love you too," he said. The words loaded with emotion so intense it took her breath away. "God help me, I love you so much it scares me." Grace smiled, leaning in to kiss him again, and that night under the stars and to the sound of waves, they made love again, not as strangers fulfilling an obligation, but as two hearts that had finally found their home in each other. Grace woke to the golden morning light, filtering through the white curtains of the beach house, the sound of waves creating a soft melody that seemed to cradle her awakening senses. For a moment she lay still, savoring the feeling of being completely relaxed for the first time in months. Then the memory of the previous night returned in warm waves, the whispered confessions, the reverent touches, the way Julian had said her name as if it was sacred. She turned in bed expecting to find him beside her, but the space was empty, only the rumpled pillow and his musky scent as evidence that she hadn't dreamed it all. A touch of insecurity passed through her. Did he regret it? Had the light of day brought doubts about what they shared? Grace wrapped herself in a silk robe Julian had left at the foot of the bed and went out to look for him. She found him on the back deck, sitting at the breakfast table with a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, looking thoughtfully at the ocean. He was wearing only white linen pants, his bare torso bronzed by the morning light, and Grace felt a wave of desire pass through her as she remembered how she had explored every defined muscle the night before. "Good morning," she said softly, hesitant. Julian turned at the sound of her voice, and the smile that lit up his face instantly dispelled all her insecurities. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, rising to pull out a chair for her. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," Grace admitted, feeling warmth rise to her face as she sat down. "And you?" "Like a baby," Julian replied, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead before returning to his chair. "Though I woke up early to think." "About what?" Grace asked, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her. Julian was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a seriousness that made Grace pay complete attention. "About us, about what happened last night and what it means for the future." Grace's stomach contracted. "Julian, if you're having regrets—" "No," he interrupted firmly, taking her hand between his. "Never. Last night it was the first time in years I felt completely alive, completely myself." Grace sighed with relief, but there was still something in his expression that made her nervous. "Then why do you look so serious?" Julian released her hand and stood up, walking to the deck railing to look at the sea. "Because last night changed everything between us, Grace. And it made me realize something important." "What?" He turned to face her, his grey eyes intense and determined. "That our marriage began with you having no real choice. You married me because you were desperate, because it was the only way to save Martha. But now..." "Now what?" Grace asked, her heart beginning to beat faster. "Now I want you to have a real choice," Julian said simply. "I want you to stay with me because you want to, not because you have to." Grace frowned, confusion coloring her voice. "Julian, I don't understand. I chose to be with you last night. I chose to tell you I love you. I know," he said softly, "but you're still trapped by our original agreement. You're still here because of circumstances, not by complete free will." Julian left the deck for a moment, returning with a brown leather briefcase that Grace hadn't noticed before. He placed the briefcase on the table between them, his movements deliberate and careful. "What is this?" Grace asked. "Your freedom," Julian said simply, opening the briefcase to reveal a stack of documents organized with legal precision. Grace looked at the papers, the words dancing before her eyes as she tried to process what she was seeing. Property deeds, bank transfers, investment documents, all with her name clearly printed as beneficiary. "Julian, what have you done?" she whispered. "I've transferred everything to you," he said, his voice calm but loaded with emotion. "The mansion, the beach houses, 51% of the shares in all my companies, the bank accounts, the investments, everything." Grace looked at him horrified. "You can't have done this. This is your entire life." "No," Julian said, kneeling beside her chair so he could look into her eyes. "My entire life is sitting in this chair, looking at me like I've lost my mind." "But why?" Grace asked, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Why would you do something like this?" Julian took her hands between his thumbs tracing gentle circles over her knuckles. "Because I want you to know that you can leave at any time, that if you stay, it's because you choose to stay. Not for money, not for obligation, not for gratitude, but because you love me." "Julian, this is insane," Grace said, her voice trembling. "What if I leave? What if I take all this and disappear?" A sad smile touched his lips. "Then I'll know I was never worthy of you to begin with, and you'll have resources to live the life you want wherever you want." Grace studied his face, searching for signs of doubt or calculation, but found only absolute sincerity. "You would really do this? Risk everything?" "Grace," Julian said, his voice broken with emotion, "when Elena died, I thought I had lost the ability to trust anyone completely, but you made me want to trust again. And true trust means being willing to be hurt." Grace looked again at the documents, the weight of what he was offering finally sinking in. It wasn't just money or properties, it was complete freedom. It was him saying he trusted her with his entire life. "There's one more thing," Julian said hesitantly, withdrawing a final document from the briefcase. "Pre-signed divorce papers, if you want to use them." Grace gasped. You want to divorce me?" "God, no," Julian said vehemently. "But I want you to know the option exists. That if you decide you don't love me enough for a lifetime together, you can leave without legal complications. Grace was silent for a long time, looking at the documents that represented more money and power than she had ever dreamed of possessing. Then she did something that completely surprised Julian. She laughed. "You're an idiot," she said affectionately, tearing the divorce papers in half. "Grace," Julian protested, "you haven't even read everything yet." "I don't need to," she said firmly, pushing all the other documents back toward him. "I don't want your fortune, Julian. I don't want your properties or your companies." Julian's face fell. You're leaving." Grace stood up from the chair and positioned herself between his legs, framing his face with her hands. "I'm saying that the only thing in this briefcase I want is you, just you." "But Grace, you don't understand. This would give you complete security, independence." "I already have those things," Grace interrupted gently. "I have them through your love, through knowing that you see me as your equal, not as your property or obligation." Julian closed his eyes, resting his forehead against hers. "Are you sure? Because once I put these papers away, I'm going to fight for you. I'm going to do everything in my power to keep you with me forever." Grace smiled, leaning in to kiss him softly. "Good, because I plan to do the same." When they separated, Julian pulled her into his lap, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I love you so much," he murmured against her hair. "So much it scares me." "Don't be afraid," Grace whispered back. "Not of me. Never of me." They stayed like that for a long time, embracing on the deck, while the sun climbed higher in the sky and the waves continued their eternal dance below. And Grace knew with a certainty that surprised her that she had finally found her home, not in a grand mansion or a bank account, but in the arms of a man who loved her enough to set her free. "Julian," she said finally. "Yes? Next time you decide to give me your entire fortune, at least warn me first. I almost had a heart attack." Julian laughed, a rich, genuine laugh that vibrated through his chest. "I promise. Though you should know I've already planned to give you much more than money." "What else could you possibly give me?" Grace asked curiously. Julian smiled, his eyes shining with a promise that made her heart race. "My entire future. Every day, every breath, every heartbeat, if you want it." "I want it," Grace said without hesitation. "I want all of that and more." And on that golden morning by the ocean, with forgotten documents scattered by the salt wind, Grace and Julian sealed a promise that was much more powerful than any legal contract. The promise of two hearts, choosing each other freely, completely, and forever. 6 months later, Grace walked through the seaside village where everything had begun to change between her and Julian. Spring had transformed the landscape, filling the air with the perfume of wildflowers and the sound of birds singing in trees that swayed gently in the warm breeze. But it was the change within herself that surprised her most, the confidence in her steps, the peace in her heart, and the unwavering certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Julian walked beside her, his fingers intertwined with hers in a way that had become as natural as breathing. There was no more hesitation in their touches, no careful formality in their conversations. The man who had once appeared at her door as a cold and intimidating stranger had revealed himself as someone capable of laughing at her bad jokes, comforting her during occasional nightmares, and dancing with her in the kitchen while Mrs. Henderson pretended not to see. "Remember the first time we came here together?" Julian asked, stopping near the spot where they had made love for the first time months ago. "How could I forget?" Grace replied, smiling at the memory. "I was so nervous I could barely form complete sentences." "You were beautiful," Julian said, bringing her hand to his lips to place a gentle kiss on her knuckles. "You still are." Grace blushed, even after all these months. Julian still had the power to make her feel like a lovesick teenager, with just a look or casual touch. They settled on the same deck where they had shared their first true vulnerabilities, but now there was an ease between them that only came with time and built trust. Grace snuggled against Julian's side, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. "Grace," Julian said softly, his fingers playing with her hair, "there's something I want to tell you." She lifted her head to look at him, noticing something different in his expression, not nervousness, but a kind of quiet solemnity. "What is it?" Julian took her hands between his thumbs tracing familiar patterns on her skin. When I proposed our original arrangement, I thought I knew exactly what I was getting. A convenient wife, pleasant company, maybe even a comfortable friendship in time. Grace nodded, remembering those first tense days when they could barely maintain a conversation. But what I received was so much more than that, Julian continued, his voice growing thicker with emotion. I received someone who brought music back to my house, someone who made Mrs. Henderson genuinely smile for the first time in years, someone who transformed Ravenshollow from a dark museum of memories into a true home. Julian, Grace began, but he shook his head gently. Let me finish, he said. I received someone who reminded me how to laugh, how to look forward to tomorrow, how to believe the future can be better than the past. I received you, Grace, all of you. And it made me realize something important. What? She asked, her heart beating faster. Julian stood up and, to Grace's complete surprise, knelt on the deck before her. When he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, Grace held her breath. I realized I married you for all the wrong reasons, he said, opening the box to reveal the most beautiful ring she had ever seen, a simple but perfect solitaire diamond, flanked by 2 small sapphires that caught the sunset light. And now I want to marry you again for all the right reasons. Grace felt tears burn her eyes. Julian, what are you doing? I'm asking you to marry me, he said, his grey eyes shining with absolute sincerity. Not because you need me, not because I can solve your problems, but because I love you, because I can't imagine a future without you in it, because you made me want to be a better man. Grace looked at the ring, then at the man kneeling before her, the man who had appeared in her life as a reluctant savior and had become her chosen partner, her best friend, her true love. The sapphires are from Elena's jewelry, Julian said softly. She always said she wanted them to be used for something happy someday. I think she would approve. Oh, Julian, Grace whispered, tears now flowing freely down her face. You don't need to ask me again. We're already married. Legally, yes, Julian agreed, but that marriage was about survival. This would be about choice, about love, about building something together because we want to, not because we have to. Grace looked into his eyes and saw her entire future reflected back. Lazy mornings in bed, dinners with Martha telling stories, nights dancing in the library, maybe even children someday running through Ravenshollow's corridors. She saw a life built on true love instead of desperate necessity. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears. Yes, Julian Blake, I will marry you again. And again after that, if you want. Julian laughed, sliding the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. It was a perfect fit, as if it had been made specifically for her. I think once more will be enough, he said, rising to pull her into his arms. But I'll keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life. And I'll keep choosing you, Grace promised, leaning in to kiss him. The kiss was different from all the others they had shared. There was no urgency in it, no shadow of uncertainty or fear. It was a kiss of promise, of coming home, of 2 people who had found their place in the world in each other. When they separated, the sun was setting completely, painting the sky pink and gold. Julian pulled Grace closer, and they stood like that, embraced on the deck where their lives had changed so dramatically. You know what's funny? Grace said, playing with the new ring on her finger. What? When you showed up at my door that rainy night, I thought you were my salvation, the man who would solve all my problems. And now? Julian asked, curiosity in his voice. Grace smiled, looking at him with eyes full of love and admiration. Now I realize you weren't my salvation. You were my choice. The best choice I ever made. Julian kissed her again, gently this time, with all the tenderness he had learned to show since she had entered his life. Funny, he murmured against her lips. I was going to say exactly the same thing about you. As they walked back to the house, hands intertwined and hearts full, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with desperation and necessity, but had transformed into something much more precious, a true partnership based on mutual respect, trust, and a love that had grown naturally from friendship and understanding. Julian was no longer the powerful stranger who had appeared with an impossible proposal. He was the man who picked flowers for her every morning, who sat with Martha to hear her stories, who held her during storms and laughed at her attempts to cook. He was her husband, her partner, her choice, and Grace was no longer the desperate woman who had accepted a marriage of convenience to save the person she loved. She was someone who had learned that true love wasn't about being saved. It was about choosing to save each other every day in all the small ways that mattered. That night, as they prepared for sleep in their shared bed at the beach house, Grace looked at the ring on her finger and smiled. Tomorrow they would return to Ravens Hollow, where Martha waited with stories to tell, and Mrs. Henderson had probably prepared their favorite desserts. But tonight was theirs, a perfect moment of arrival at the end of a journey that had begun with a contract and ended with a choice. "I love you, Mrs. Blake," Julian whispered in the darkness, pulling her closer. "I love you too, Mr. Blake," Grace whispered back. "Forever." And in those simple words was all the difference in the world, because this time when she said "I do," she wasn't accepting a business arrangement or a desperate way out. She was accepting a lifetime of love, built on the strongest foundation of all, the free choice of two hearts that had decided to beat as one. Grace had discovered that true love doesn't come like lightning. It grows like a carefully watered plant, day after day, choice after choice. What began as a desperate agreement between strangers had transformed into the deepest union she could have ever imagined. Julian was no longer the cold man who had appeared at her door on a rainy night. He was the partner who chose every day to love and be loved. Sometimes, life's greatest blessings come disguised as desperation, and the happiest endings are born from the most unlikely beginnings. Because in the end, Grace learned that she didn't need to be saved. She just needed the courage to choose love when it presented itself. And you? Have you ever had the courage to choose love, even when everything seemed impossible? If this story touched you, hit that like button to show you believe in the power of true love. Subscribe to the channel and tell me, where are you listening from right now? Your support is what brings these stories to life.